As useful as virtual machines are, they involve virtualizing an entire computer, whereas with containers, the virtualization involves the application. Now, as well as being easy to deploy and maintain, containers will require far fewer resources. And although Proxmox VE gives you access to legacy containers, you can also run the more popular Docker platform as well. The recommendation, though, is to create a virtual machine and install Docker in that so that you can get the best of both technologies. In addition, there's less chance that the hypervisor's operating system will be compromised because the containers will share the one on the virtual machine. But how do you install Docker in Proxmox VE? Well, if that's something that you're interested in finding out, then stick around and watch this video, because that's what we'll be going over. Now, the first thing to do is to create a virtual machine and install a Debian operating system onto that, although you can use a different operating system if you prefer. But to save time, I'm going to assume that you already know how to create a virtual machine in Proxmox VE and how to install the operating system onto that. So as you can see, I've actually skipped ahead, and this particular computer that we're going to be using is running the latest version of Debian. Now, there are different ways that you can install Docker, but because I want the latest version, what we're going to do is to actually update the repository. That way we'll actually get our version of Docker directly from the actual developer. But because normally by default a Debian computer doesn't have the sudo package installed, what we're going to do first is to switch to the root account. So I'm going to use the switch user command for that. Then I need to provide the actual password for root. Then what I need to do is to download some dependencies, but I'm going to make sure that the repository cache is up to date first using apt-update. And then I'm going to tell it to download the dependencies. So off it goes and downloads those. Well, now that that's done, what we need to do is to download and install Docker's GPG key. So first we need to make sure that we've got a directory and that it's got the proper permissions. Then we'll actually get the key itself. And then we'll make sure that permissions for that file are set correctly as well. And then finally what we're going to do is to actually update the repository details on this actual computer, because at the moment it really just knows about Debian's own repository, but we want the actual files from Docker itself. So we're actually telling it here about the actual repository for Docker, but we need that GPG key to be able to do this. There's quite a lot involved in this actual set of commands that we've got here, and this is all covered on my blog. But I'm going to hit return, and that updates the repository information on this computer, which means now I'm going to do an apt update, and it's not just going to actually go out and check Debian. As you can see, it's actually going out to check Docker as well. Because it's then done that, what we can do is to tell it to install a series of commands that we're interested in. So the Docker engine, we're using the community engine incidentally, but we're also interested in Docker Compose as well, which is extremely useful. So I'm going to hit return, and off it goes. And then once I've just answered that prompt, to install all of those actual files plus any dependencies that go with them. So now that Docker's installed, what we can do is to actually test it out. And the most common way to do that is to run docker run hello world. In other words, what we're doing is to run the Docker command, and we're telling it to run the image hello-world. Now, what you'll find is when I hit return, it's actually going to go off and actually download the actual file, or image I should say, simply because it doesn't already exist on this computer. And once it's actually downloaded it, it then actually runs the actual image, which just basically just gives you some feedback here. But if I run that command again, it just runs it straight away, because this time it didn't have to actually download it. Now, one thing that you have to bear in mind when it comes to Docker is that we're running containers which are relying on the actual underlying operating system, in this case Debian. And for that reason, it's actually best to run these using a non-root account, because if you actually run them as root, the potential is there that whatever's in that container could get access to the operating system and start actually executing commands as root. So to try to limit the fallout, we're going to create a completely new user specifically to use with Docker. So I'm just going to call this one Docker Manager, but you can obviously call this whatever you like. Then it's going to ask for information, so what's the password for this account? Confirm that. Then you can fill in the details if you like. I'm just going to leave these blank. Just say yes, that the information is correct. And it creates our user. To be able to use Docker, we need to add the user to the Docker group. And then what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to switch over to that actual user account. So I'm just using the switch user command to do that. And note, because I'm actually logged in as root, I don't even need to provide the password for that user. So that's something to bear in mind. Now, at the moment, we're in that root folder. So what I want to do is just go back to the home folder. So I'm just going to put CD to go back to the home folder for this user. Because going forward, anything I would do with this user, I want it to be in its own home folder. As do a present working directory, says it's in the home folder of /Docker Manager there. Next thing to do is just to check and make sure that this user account can actually use Docker. So we'll use the same hello world image. So just hit return. And there you go. That user can now actually use Docker. Well, hopefully, as you can see, Docker is pretty easy to install. And although containers do look to be less secure than virtual machines, you can mitigate some of the risks by creating a dedicated virtual machine to run Docker. You can even create separate Docker instances for your different security areas of your network. So, for example, we could have one for management, one for IoT, and so on. And that should reduce the chance of someone being able to break out of a less secure network and gain access to devices in a more secure network. But overall, Docker containers are an extremely useful way to maintain applications and reduce the demand for compute resources. Now, if you find this video to be useful, then do consider subscribing to the channel, as that would really mean a lot to me. But it's also a good indicator to let me know how videos like this are helpful to people such as yourself that are watching. In which case, thank you. On the other hand, if you're not ready for that level of commitment, then I'd really appreciate it if you could press the like button, because that way that'll help to get the video out to other people that might find it useful as well.